Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of a brand new series on my second channel. So I mentioned last week that I'd like to do one or two rambling videos a week where I just talk at length about something Star Wars related. I'm sure I'll include somewhere in the description or in the tagged comment the first episode in the series where I talked about my 6 favorite Star Wars movies, but today we're going to do something slightly different and do some kind of live rambling versus episodes. I haven't done as many verses as I used to on the main channel. I got sort of burnt out from doing it. It tended to cause a lot of controversy, and it was a lot of the time a lot of guesswork. Also, they're not the most fun videos to make, especially for the obscure legend ships. So like, for example, the Mediator class cruiser. There's maybe one image of that ship that I can use. So to stretch that out for 5-10 minutes is really difficult. So that was one reason. Also, a lot of the times in Star Wars, we don't get full numbers, or the numbers change or are inconsistent, or we only get them in one place and they're hard to verify. So I think it's a bit more fun to do the matchup in this sort of conversational tone. And I've got at least 3 versus battles that I'd like to do today. I'm going to keep an eye on the Discord as I record this. I put out an ask for suggestions, so if any come in while I'm recording, I'll also include those. So number 1 is the Praetor Mark II class battlecruisers versus the Mediator Star Cruiser. And this is really a great example of a matchup that serves well in this format, but not in a full video. A lot of this will kind of come down to how I feel. So the Mediator was a purpose-built Mon Calamari warship. During the Galactic Civil War, most of the Mon Cal cruisers were repurposed from either starliners or civilian ships of some sort, but once the war ended and the New Republic was formally established, they started creating some actual warships. For example, we have the MC-90, we have the larger Viscount, and we have the Mediator. Mon Calamari ships are really well known for just being super sturdy, for being really well designed, for not having as many obvious flaws as, say, an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. The old Mon Calamari ships, the MC-80s, for example, were roughly equivalent to a Star Destroyer when it comes to firepower, maybe slightly less powerful, but the Viscount certainly, which was sort of a dreadnought analog, and I think we'll talk about that later, and the Mediator were certainly a step up, and this is because the New Republic realized that they needed more large ships. They had been relying on, even with the fleet modernization program, they were still relying on small, flexible fleets. Like even the new cruisers and the new carriers weren't usually longer than 2 kilometers, something they changed with the Viscount. But the Mediator itself also isn't longer than 2 kilometers, but was still one of the larger New Republic ships. I believe we only really get its size in reference to a Yuuzhan Vong ship in one of the new Jedi Order books. And this kind of explains why it's difficult to really do these matchups, especially with the New Republic has so many ships that they just call cruisers or frigates or star cruisers, for example. And the Essential Guide to Warfare comes in and it kind of adds numbers. Like, for example, it'll give a length for the Yuuzhan Vong ship. Then people will go back retroactively and use that to help figure out the length for the Mediator, which is questionable at best. But it was still a large warship. Again, dreadnoughts in Star Wars Legends. Oh, that's what happens in the rambling video. I don't know if you guys heard my computer, just the Creative Cloud had an update. But anyways, dreadnoughts in the Star Wars universe are the rarity. Ships like this were still rare, and then smaller ships were much more common. But we never got an idea of what the weaponry on a ship like this is. It was ultra modern. I'm sure it was maybe 1.5 times as deadly as a Star Destroyer, but that's not really a good way to do a formal matchup. Let's, though, take a quick look at the Praetor Mark II, and this is a ship that first appeared in the old Marvel comics. It was the flagship for Admiral Gael. And I believe that its design was based off an early mock-up for the Executor class Super Star Destroyer, but I'm not positive about that. I don't have any sources in front of me. But when you look at the size of the Praetor Mark II, it's clearly a battle cruiser. It's like the next size up for capital ships. We get some good shots of it during the whole Teasel crisis. It's not a crisis, but during the Teasel arc where it's next to some Star Destroyers, and it's clearly, like, I don't know, maybe 4 times longer and, similar difference in width. So this is a proper battle cruiser, not like a large cruiser, like a proper battle cruiser. So just based off that alone, I don't see how the New Republic and their Mediator would be able to keep up unless we've been misled with how large the ship is. This is just a pretty substantial difference in size. This is like a ship that's 2 kilometers long versus one that's probably 5 to 6 with similar differences in weaponry. And the change in technology, 30 years difference in technology is not enough to make up for just the blunt weapon that the Praetor Mark II is. So yeah, the Imps win round 1. For round 2 now, we have the Viscount class Star Defender, the largest ship ever created by the New Republic, going up against the Executor class Super Star Destroyer. So I kind of realize that I say all of these terms and I've maybe never really explained what I mean. So when I say Executor class Super Star Destroyer, the Super Star Destroyer is sort of like the ship type. It's a dreadnought or a very large ship. And then the Executor is the type of Super Star Destroyer. So, and the Executor specifically is the one that we see in the films. It's kind of confusing because there's also a ship of the Executor line called the Executor. That was the one that crashes into the Death Star. But I just thought I'd explain that because I know I take some of this for granted because I can read and talk about this stuff all day, but not everyone is as up to date. But the thing about the Viscount is it was, at least as the ship line as a whole, was created after the Black Fleet crisis, which I've talked about that because I just finished the trilogy, so I did a few videos on that. But in the Black Fleet crisis, they're not Imperials, but the Duskon League, they find this lost Imperial fleet with 2 Super Star Destroyers and a dozen Star Destroyers. It's quite an impressive force. So in response, kind of with the realization that they need to bulk up and not just rely on, because the New Republic has their new fleet, but it's still not powerful enough to take on dreadnoughts head to head. So the New Republic creates this new line, this new dreadnought, and it's supposed to be basically, it was created as a match for the now fairly old Executor class Super Star Destroyer. So in theory, the Viscount should certainly be able to win this. And looking at things practically, it's got very similar weaponry. It just has more ion cannons and I think less missiles. But the weaponry is very, very similar. And they've got, 30 years of improvements in shield technology and hull strength. And the ship was made specifically to counter the Executor. So if the Viscount loses this fight, that means the New Republic screwed up. But I don't think it would lose. The Viscount is just a better ship. It's got less serious flaws than the Executor does while still carrying similar amounts of weaponry. Generally, New Republic starfighters were also superior to those of the Empire. I mean, everyone's starfighters were superior to those of the Empire. It's also questionable, how many starfighters each ship has. Like, if the Viscount has 100 and the Executor has 1,000, then the Executor would win, and vice versa. But that's all highly variable depending on the specific ship and its mission priorities. But just generally, the Viscount wins this one fairly easily. Without starfighters, it wins. With a similar amount of starfighters, it wins, and certainly with more. And again, the Mon Calamari have a huge advantage here because they are specifically building a counter to another ship. This is one of the reasons, I think, why relying and being slaved purely to numbers, turbolaser numbers, cannon numbers, starfighter numbers, what have you, is sometimes bad, and also sometimes why just through pure logic you can figure out a matchup. You just have to look at the circumstances for the creation of both of these ships. The Executor is also interesting because it represents Star Wars Legends in a way and how inconsistent material was, especially early on. I don't know how many different sizes there were for the Executor, but I remember reading the X-Wing trilogy, and I think the length they give it is 7 kilometers or 7 miles. Regardless, it's the wrong length. And there's no real reason for that for that switch. It just kind of shows that I don't think everyone was really talking at the beginning, and also that at least they were willing to, if something didn't work, just disregard that old information. The mechanics of warfare definitely changed a lot since the early Star Wars days up until like the canon as it existed before Legends ended. So that's interesting. Like if you read even the old X-Wing books and Thrawn's Revenge, not Thrawn's Revenge, and the Thrawn trilogy, and then, go read something far later, things have definitely changed pretty considerably. Also kind of reminds me of how ridiculous like some Star Wars fans could be in trying to like take scenes apart to find information out about their ships. Like I remember, or I've read about the fact that people legitimately figured out and were confident about the size of the Death Star based on that scene where the Super Star Destroyer crashes down into it, but the Death Star isn't shown really curving. And StarDestroyer.net is the famous site that does that. Like they'll use that asteroid scene where the Star Destroyer shoots an asteroid and vaporizes it. They'll use that to determine the yield of Star Wars weapons, as if such a thing is even possible. And ignoring, it's like they'll go through this intricate mathematical equation and then ignore all logic, like ignore the fact that clearly the yield of a Star Destroyer is not as it's presented in that scene. So you got to be careful about reading too much in, like when figuring things out for lore purposes, reading too much into a scene. The asteroid's an example of that. Saying the Death Star is 600 kilometers, the Death Star 2, is 600 kilometers because of the lack of a curve when the Executor hits. Those are both examples of that. I think Pablo Hidalgo on Twitter, he once basically said that when you watch Star Wars, you should imagine it being told by someone. Like that's how he just explains slight discrepancies between different movie versions, and also things like little continuity errors that don't affect the story. It's like you just gotta go with it, but don't slave the lore to visual storytelling, because storytelling is always going to come first. They're always going to do what looks best and what feels coolest. So you shouldn't misinterpret that and think that they're trying to necessarily make a lore statement. So the final battle that I think is interesting is the Providence class Dreadnought versus the MC-85 Raddus, which is the Resistance's new ship in The Last Jedi. This one is interesting because we've got a separation here of like, I don't know exactly when the first Providence was created, how far before the Clone Wars, but we've got a separation of about 60 years. But the Raddus is a fairly gimped vessel offensively. I've got to pull up, I don't like to have to pull up these stat pages, but I don't have my copy of the cross-section. Okay, so let's see. The Raddus is 3.5 kilometers long with a width of 700 meters. Not super important. And then 18 heavy turbo lasers, 18 heavy ion cannons, 12 point defense cannons, 6 concussion missile launchers, then the starfighter. So that is not a lot of weaponry for a ship of that size. And I believe, I don't know if we've fully got the lore, but I believe that this is probably because of the military disarmament that the New Republic did. I believe I read that this is the last ship that was made before the disarmament, but it was still nothing. Like if the Empire had a ship that was 3.5 kilometers long, it would have had like 12 times as many weapons. But we see 18 turbo lasers, or 18 heavy turbo lasers, and maybe like in Star Wars canon, the future of weaponry tech is instead of having many turbo laser batteries, you focus your weapons into a few cannons, which are very powerful, which I think would make sense. We see something similar with the Supremacy, which when trying to shoot down the Raddus, it uses those main extraordinarily heavy turbo lasers at the front of the ship. So maybe like that's just maybe those 18 heavy turbo lasers is like power-wise equivalent to having hundreds or, at least dozens of turbo laser batteries. But just also, I don't think, I never really cared if a ship didn't have that many concussion missile launchers. I think 6 is enough. Star Wars doesn't really use missile spam. Like, usually it fires a few at once. But what about the Providence? Let's see. So the Providence has 2 sizes. It's got like the Dreadnought size and I think it's called the Carrier size. Just pulling up the stats. The Dreadnought size is 2.17 kilometers long. We have weaponry, but I believe this would be for the Carrier / the Cruiser. So 14 quad turbo laser cannons, 34 laser cannons, 2 heavy ion cannons, 12-point defense cannons. So you can probably double all of those numbers if we're going to realistically look at the Dreadnought version. Quad turbo lasers aren't super heavy, and the Invisible Hand, the Providence generally, is kind of in a position where most of its weaponry is on the sides of the ship. It does have a couple sets of guns, I believe, on these like little cliff faces, but most of the weaponry would be on the side. This is a ship that is a good for broadsiding vessels, which is what you see in the Battle of Coruscant. Because it's kind of like an old pirate ship, really, and I'm sure that was the inspiration for it. Also interesting, this matchup is interesting because I believe that the Providence, the Mon Cal worked on it, or the Quarren at least. So yeah, these ships would be like second cousins once removed. But the Raddus, okay, so the Raddus is larger, and it's 40 to 60 years newer. It also has obviously incredible shielding technology. All Mon Calamari ships operate pretty effectively as carriers, so I don't really see how the Providence can win this. I think its best bet is if it can bring with it a bunch of... we have to also assume that the Providence is that the Raddus is fully loaded, because by the time of The Last Jedi, there aren't that many Resistance members. They probably didn't have enough pilots or starfighters to fully stock the ship. I'm not sure if the turbo lasers and everything were fully computerized. I know much of the ship was. But yeah, it's an interesting question. If the Raddus is fully decked out, if all of its turbo lasers are armed, if it's got its full complement of starfighters, and I bet you it can carry a lot. I mean, the Home One carried 100 plus starfighters, and it was just barely over a kilometer long. This is 3 times as long. But I mean, it's funny when you look at the hangar in The Last Jedi, the ships are just like sitting there. When you have droid starfighters or TIE fighters, they're in racks. So, it's very compact. And so the best chance that the Providence would have is to overwhelm the 18 laser cannons of the Raddus with just a starfighter swarm. Because even if the laser cannons are more powerful, if there's only, I think it was 18, if there's only 12 of them, so less. If there's only 12 of them, then it doesn't matter if they're one-shotting starfighters. There's still going to be some that get through. So, yeah. But fully armed, I think I give the slight edge to the Raddus, just because I don't see how a ship that's larger and more modern can lose unless it's gimped that badly. And I also like the resistant starfighters better. One thing people often say is that, well, you don't really see differences in technology in the Star Wars universe. And I disagree completely. I mean, in Star Wars Legends, ships get, clearly, they're better designed, they have better computer systems, the shielding is stronger, and, the Imperial Star Destroyer becomes somewhat antiquated, partially because it's not a really well-designed ship, but when compared to, the self-sufficient carriers of the New Republic, and that's in Legends, too. If you go back even farther into, the days of the Old Republic, you see ships with, very few weapons, very small. But in canon, we've seen this even more. As we've moved into the new era, the First Order has a bunch of new technology. The Resistance, I'm sure, doesn't have the same degree of technological improvement, but it's still there to some degree, I would imagine. So yeah, with the 40 to 50 year difference in the extra size, I give it to the Raddus. But if we're dealing with the as it was staffed and as it existed in The Last Jedi, then I think a standard Providence could take it. But that's just my opinion. Do you think that the Providence, like if the MSD couldn't bust through the shields of the Raddus from far away, do you think the Providence could get close enough to do so itself, even with, a lot less firepower than the MSD? I'm not sure. Let me know what you think down in the comment section. Let me know if you enjoyed this idea for a video. If you guys didn't like it, I've only spent, when I do a video, you spend like 6-8 hours, however long doing it. When I do this, I spend, 15 minutes recording. I make a thumbnail, I do the SEO, but it's not really a huge deal. So if you like this, let me know, and I'd be happy to do one of these a week along with another rambling video. But yeah, it all depends what you guys want. If you do want more, make sure to let me know down in the comments what ships you'd like me to do next. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. As always, this has been EckhartsLadder. May the Force be with you.